Okay, hello and welcome everyone to our last breakout session for today, Track to Architecting Your Disease Community, sponsored by Mallinckrodt Pharmaceuticals. I'm Ann Bruns and I'll be your host today for the last breakout of day one of our summit. Just a reminder, this is being live streamed and I want to welcome our remote attendees and remind everyone to download the mobile app. If you have a question, you can go ahead and text in your question and we can get it asked to our speakers during the question and answer session. Okay, so our last breakout session for today is going to be providing a look into patient-focused drug development meetings with the FDA and exploring the benefits and challenges of holding these for your community. So we're excited to have Jill Jarecki, Chief Scientific Officer at Cure SMA, Joy Aldrich from Charcot-Marie Tooth Advocacy Director, and Allison Moore, Founder and Chief Executive Officer at the Hereditary Neuropathy Foundation, and they're going to share with us their experience and what it means to be part of the drug development review process.
Hi, so is this on? I think it is. So hi, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to speak here today. I am the Chief Scientific Officer at Cure SMA, and I'm going to be telling you about a patient-focused drug development meeting, an externally led one that we had in April of 2017. I just want to start out and say that I'm talking on behalf of Rose Angel Cruz, who's the Director of Clinical Affairs at Cure SMA, and this patient-focused drug development meeting was really her baby. She organized it and executed it, so hopefully will give it justice to all of her hard work. So just briefly, Cure SMA is a nonprofit organization. We were founded in 1984 to fund groundbreaking research and also to support families living with the disease. We have grown a lot from being an organization started by a couple of parents around a kitchen table to an organization where we have about 115,000 supporters, 12,000 affected members, 350 newly diagnosed contacts each year, about 75 million total in research funding, and an annual conference with 2,000 attendees. And so I'll tell you a little bit about how we thought about our patient-focused drug development meeting and why we had it and how we executed it. And when we thought about our patient-focused drug development meeting, we really thought about it as a piece of a strategy in FDA interactions. It's not, a one and done. You have your PFDD and then you don't interact with the FDA anymore. So it's really a piece of the puzzle in relationship building with the FDA. And so I think when you think about relationship building with the FDA, there are probably multiple groups that you want to interact with. Of course, there are the groups like the Office of Strategic Programs, or PACE, or the Office of Rare Diseases that are really helpful. But it's also really important to think about which review agencies at CDER and CBER you want to interact with and invite to your patient-focused drug development meeting, and also just do relationship building with. And the three different areas that we thought were important to do relationship building with the FDA is to provide the patient perspective on the impact of the disease and activities of daily living, to have discussions about clinical trial design, outcome measures, biomarkers, et cetera, and then actually talk to them both about benefit and risk, what patients feel is meaningful to them, and what risk they're willing to accept in that trade-off of that. And so really, when you think about your strategy with interacting with the FDA, I think it's a multi-pronged and probably a long-term approach, and you just want to tell them what's important to your community. So here just is a list of activities that Cure SMA and the SMA community had with the FDA leading up to our externally led patient-focused drug development meeting. Since I joined Cure SMA in 2005, we've often had FDA representatives at our conference. In 2011 and 2014, we had scientific meetings co-hosted by NIH and FDA, one on the NIH campus and one on the FDA campus, really focused on clinical trial design and outcome measures. And this was really at the early stage of clinical trials in SMA, so it's important to start early and start talking to them as soon as possible. But because Cure SMA is a patient-focused organization, we really wanted to move it beyond just talking about science with them and having talk about the patient perspective, what's meaningful for them. And in order to do that, we took on a couple of different projects leading up to our patient-focused drug development meeting. This included doing focus groups on clinically meaningfulness and patient journey, which we published in scientific journals and sent to the FDA, and then doing a booklet on the voices of SMA, where it was organized around the themes that we found from these focus groups, so we could really have the FDA understand the impact of the disease on patients' lives. And then we thought that, the patient-focused drug development meeting would be really important so they could hear directly from patients, have direct interactions with our community. So, why host a externally led patient-focused drug development meeting? Well, as I said, it's a piece of this building a relationship with the FDA. Here I have a quote from Dr. Wilson Bryant, who spoke at our patient-focused drug development meeting. And he basically said, and I think this answers that question, is this lets us hear directly from the patients what's important to them and how, as regulators, they should think about the disease and think about making drug approvals. And so I think that's why you want to have this, so you can communicate directly how your patient population thinks about drug development and what's important to them in a drug. So one of the things that was important for us when planning our patient-focused drug development meeting was that we had broad participation across our entire patient community. We actually had 422 individuals registered to attend, 204 in person, and 218 via webcast. And 98 of those were individuals with SMA, their parents, or caregivers. And in order to sort of drive family participation and for families to be able to attend the meeting, because it's hard for patients with SMA to travel, we had the meeting in conjunction with a Cure SMA event, our local chapter leadership summit, the next day, so that patients could cross over and caregivers and not have to travel to two separate SMA events in the same time of the year. We had 31 representatives from different advocacy organizations, so we wanted to have cross-community participation. We had 16 people from the FDA there, 27 people from industry members working on SMA drug development, and 6 clinicians. Oh, here you can just see a picture of the meeting. So it was really important to us that we had the FDA participate. And we had 3 FDA speakers, Billy Dunn, who's the director of the Division of Neurology Products, Jonathan Goldsmith, who is the director for rare diseases, and has retired since then, and Wilson Bryan, who's one of the directors at CBER, working on gene therapies, relevant to gene therapies for SMA. And we've spent a lot of time and effort ensuring that FDA people could attend, sending them personalized invitations, sending them written invitations, having the people in the Office of Strategic Planning, which is the group out of the FDA that helps facilitate these patient drug development meetings, sent out a notice to the people at the FDA. But I think it's really one of the things that will make your meeting most successful if you spend a lot of time and effort getting the right people there. So this is just, there are a few quotes intersprinkled through here about comments that the speakers from the FDA made during the meeting, and I think they just bring, I won't read it to you, but they really enhance and I think emphasize why these kind of meetings could be important to your patient community. So things that we learned, things that we discovered along the way that are important to this process. So this process takes a lot of time and effort, and so Rose Angel probably spent about 6 months of her life working on this project, at least 80% of her time. So it's a big project. And it has a significant budget attached to it. So it's fairly resource intensive, I think, both on the personnel side and on the funding side. And I think when you want to have a successful meeting, I think the first thing to think about are what are your goals? What do you think the themes you want the FDA to know about? And how can you organize the meeting to bring out those specific points that you want to make? Educate yourself about the process. And the way we did that, because we were pretty early on in this externally led patient drug development process, was we read every voice of the patient report that was out there. We asked people for their letters of intent. We talked to the people who had gone before us at the MDF and the Amyloidosis Society. We asked them for their materials. I mean, don't be afraid to ask people to help you, because we borrowed and stole from everyone we could in order to see what the vast, how other people had ran their meetings, including what the FDA has put out there from the internally led ones. We also hired a regulatory consultant named James Valentine, who's from Heinemann Phelps. He's done a lot of these. James was really, really helpful. We have enough staff at QSMA that he did not plan the day-to-day activities of this meeting. We handled all the logistics. He just gave us high-level advice on how to bring out the right themes, how to get the FDA there, and it really helped us more on a strategic level than on a logistical level, but that can depend on the size of your organization. The way we organized our meeting, so SMA, I don't know, most of you might not know about SMA, but SMA has a wide spectrum of clinical presentation, from very early onset mortality to more mild forms that present in adulthood. So we had 4 different panels. 2 panels on disease impact from the severe form of the disease, and then 2 panels, and then another panel from the mild and intermediate form of the disease. And then a second series of panels on the ideal treatment and unmet medical need, broken down by severity again. And then we had unique polling questions for all 4 panels. And I think I'll touch on that as well as Allison, but this polling question issue can be quite tricky, so that's something that you're going to want to think a lot about, and as I said, I'll touch on that in a few slides. So before I go on to that, I just say that the voice of the patient report is going to be your output. And you hope that the FDA will use that in decision-making to think about what the patient perspective is when they're doing drug approvals. So you really want to make that as effective as it can be. And so it's important to think about that early in the process. So one of the things that we did is we engaged a science writer and had them on staff. We made a transcript of the meeting so we could go back and double check things, and we could pull out all these nice quotes from the FDA. We went back and looked at all the other reports that were out there to think about what's the right format for us. We really used the report to emphasize the key themes. So, we had some reiterations of the report and tried to be comprehensive that were way too long. And my opinion was they just wouldn't be useful. No one would read that thing that's like 200 pages long. So our solution was to have a lengthy appendix, for better or worse. But I think you really want to think about how useful this is going to be rather than making it as long as possible. And then one thing that we struggled with, and so I advise people to think about it early on, is one of the typical sections in this Voice of the Patient report is a benefit-risk framework. And when we looked back after our meeting, we realized that we really only had a benefit framework. We only had our patients talking about what they wanted, not what risks were tolerable to them. So we were kind of stymied about how we were going to deal with that. And then we decided that we would do a post-hoc benefit risk survey in order to fill in that gap of trying to also present the patient view on the risk side. So some other lessons learned is that when you're doing externally led PFDD comparison to an internally led one, the organization, the advocacy organization, and the community really has to lead on content. And you have to lead on finding FDA speakers, and you have to lead on getting the FDA to attend. So it's important to talk to the Office of Strategic Programs. They will be really helpful, and they will give you advice, but you have to have realistic expectations on how much they can do and what their involvement can be. Another lesson we learned is really prepare your panelists well. We invited panelists that we knew well and we knew were well-spoken and would be comfortable in this setting. We had them write up written testimonies and practice their comments. And then we had we actually helped them refocus those in order not to change, not to speak in their own words, but so that their emphasis were on things that were important for the FDA to know, because each panelist only has 2 or 3 minutes to talk. We also, I touch on this in another slide, had our moderator participate in all of this so that the moderator could intimately get to know and have a close relationship with the panelists. So here's just some more lessons learned, which is polling questions. The polling questions are really tricky, and I think we learned some lessons from our polling questions that maybe people didn't interpret it the way they thought they would interpret it. So I would really suggest when you're developing your polling questions, have clinicians read them, have families read them, have patients read them, and make sure they say what you think they say. One of the other things is that make sure that we had questions for all 4 of our panels. And it wasn't always clear that the people out in cyberspace who answered these polling questions knew that the questions applied to which subgroup. And so one thing we found is that it's pretty obvious that we had the wrong people answering the wrong questions, and that's a big problem. So make sure you make it clear who should be answering these questions, because you really don't have control of the people out in cyberspace who during an 8-hour meeting are not going to sit there for 8 hours. They're going to be coming in and out of the, videotaping, watching, and not really know what's going on. I think that one of the most important things for having a successful PFDD is to pick your moderator really carefully. And we used James Valentine from Hyman Phelps. And James was really, really good because he understood how to keep the conversation strategic and not go off on tangents, and keep it to areas that the FDA would be interested in. We had advice from some of the people that had gone before us not to use a clinician or someone as a moderator, because they aren't as familiar with what the FDA wants to hear and could go off on all sorts of tangents and you could lose focus, and we were really happy with that. As another thing is logistics, AV. Make sure all of that works. Just test it, till you're blue in the face, because the last thing you want is a big AV disaster on the day of the meeting. And like I already said, think about the benefit risk section early. The benefit section is relatively easy. The risk section is much more challenging. Okay, influences outcomes. What do we think came out of our PFDD meeting? We've had it almost 18 months ago. I think we felt that the FDA understood our patient population better. We think that they had a more intimate understanding of what was important to them. We think it helped us enhance our relationship with the FDA and gave us the ability to go back to them and say, we'd like another meeting, a one-on-one meeting to talk about X or Y that came out of the conversation there. I think it is a great opportunity to engage with other players in the field, other advocacy organizations outside of your space. Like, we couldn't have done this without the help of all these other organizations that went before us, and to help build a more cohesive community by engaging the entire disease community. So, we heard back from our patients and our patient population and everybody at the meeting that they felt that this meeting was really meaningful to them, that they felt like they were heard by the FDA, that they felt it had an impact. And it really, I think, did build hope in our community. And we heard back from the FDA that they understood, they also heard what our community was telling them. And this is a quote from the meeting from Dr. Goldsmith, who really recognized the determination and passion that our community had. And another quote from Dr. Bryan, basically saying that much of our medical education comes from hearing from the patients from themselves, and we really value this opportunity. And so we just some things we're doing right now to culminate this experience is, of course, our Voice of the Patient report was published and posted on the FDA site. They're now posting the external reports. Some other advocacy organizations are building comprehensive pages around PFDD meetings like Faster Cures, and we're actually trying to publish the results and findings of our PFDD in a peer-reviewed journal. And so thank you, and I think we'll turn it to Allison, and then we'll take questions at the end.
Thank you, Jill, very much. And I want to thank Global Genes for having us here today. Joy and I are both from the Hereditary Neuropathy Foundation. I'm a patient, caregiver, and an advocate. And Joy is also a patient and an advocate. I can't see the slides, so Joy is going to help me with this. So luckily, I printed them. Are we ready? It's been an incredibly exciting week for us at H&F as we hosted our PFDD meeting and annual patient-centered behavioral health summit this past weekend. When we started thinking about writing a letter of intent to conduct the meeting, from this slide you can see that we were somewhat intimidated. Ready? This picture exemplifies what it is really like and the positive impact that our FDA program lead, Meghana Chalasani, had in planning. We are still on cloud 9. Back in November at our annual patient-centered summit at MIT, we received the acceptance letter from the FDA that our LOI, letter of intent, was approved to host the PFDD meeting. We quickly created this graphic and made the announcement to the participants at the summit. We knew it would end up being a monumental day for the Charcot-Marie-Tooth and inherited patient community. We dug deep into data mining of our patient registry, natural history studies, conducted more IRB-approved study surveys, conducted pediatric focus groups, and heavily relied on some of our partners, particularly on our Inspire online patient community, our scientific and medical advisory board members, and the work of those advocates that held these meetings before us, especially Jill and Rosangel from Cure SMA, Isabel Lusada from ARC, and Ryan Fisher from PPMD. After curating and analyzing all our data, we were on our way to the framework of this meeting. Our data curation led us to organize 3 panel discussions: the voice of the pediatric and adult patient, the voice of the adult CMT patient, and the patient perspectives on treatments. As Jill did an incredible job highlighting the process as well as the details of what it takes to pull off a successful meeting, we thought it is important to highlight today the biggest challenges of planning the meeting, which was developing the polling questions. These are crucial in capturing what matters most to patients when thinking about a treatment. We had a total of 12 questions with hundreds and hundreds of responses, but today we will highlight one that really stood out to the FDA, which of the following measurements, and the question that we used at the end was, which was the following measurements would you discourage you from participating in a clinical trial? Here are the results. And what truly stood out, and in fact was mentioned by the closing remarks of the Acting Associate Director of Rare Diseases Program at the FDA, was Dr. Lewis Kempf. There's 2 discouraging measures, and the ones that stood out were the walking unaided, or otherwise known as the 6-minute walk test, and painful EMG studies. Today, these 2 measures are highly relied on in clinical trials for our patient community, as well as for many rare disease groups that are here today. Maybe reevaluating clinical trial design is necessary. What was also astonishing is our community is willing to do most anything possible for a treatment. One aspect of our meeting we were most proud of was we filmed and we produced a day in the life of a CMT family. We would like to share that with you now, and we hope it's going to work. We had some trouble with getting the video on today, so hopefully, are we ready to play? Each one of us is on our own unique journey. We come from different countries, backgrounds, genders, races, and religions. We are mothers, fathers, sons, daughters. We are wives, husbands, caregivers, and friends. Despite these differences, we all share two common threads among us: an undeniable drive to keep moving forward and an ever-growing hope for future treatments. We are the faces of CMT. There are over 2.6 million people living in the world with Charcot-Marie Tooth. This is the story of only one family.
A day without CMT would be like amazing. My name is Reagan. I'm 9 years old. I'm gonna be 10 in December. And I have CMT.
My name is Phil Warren, and I have CMT.
My name is Brooke Warren. I'm a board member of the Hereditary Neuropathy Foundation. 2 people in my family are affected with CMT, both my husband and my daughter.
I found out about CMT when I was, I want to say 10 or 11.
We first found out that Reagan had CMT shortly after she was born. We tested her, and I remember getting the news that day. We were both obviously very upset.
I have CMT type 1A, which I think means that one of the parents has it.
I have CMT. My mother has CMT, and we think that her father had CMT.
CMT has historically been somewhat of a hidden disease within families. It certainly was within Phil's family. There are some families that don't even know they have it until one family member has a very visible portion of it.
To this day, I don't think I've ever really had a conversation with my father about CMT.
In the beginning, CMT was Phil's disease, so to speak, and then we had a child. It kind of became more our thing.
Brooke, my wife, is very open about everything, and so it ultimately got me comfortable talking about it. And so I'm really glad that she's encouraged the same thing with Reagan, and so that Reagan's very open about it.
Welcome to Reagan's room tour. Today with Reagan Warren. Okay, let's go. This is Sherlock. He's my fish. I had Watson, but he died, sadly. This is my night brace, but it hurts a lot.
I mean, she's amazing. She's creative, and she's got a personality that there's no 4th grader in the world like her, 100% guaranteed.
This is my bed. It's a lovely bed, you know? Like, put the head all the way down and the feet up, and I'm like the most comfortable woman ever. This is the life.
Reagan's, she's incredible. Right away, she exudes this amusement, this happiness, and this innocence that's something that gives me a lot of energy.
I want to be a lot of things when I grow up. Some of them are based on like what the future may be for me and if like my hip gets better and stuff. I do want to be a police officer.
At older ages, I worry that will she be able to work? How impacted she will be.
I also want to be an interior designer or a photographer because those don't really rely on my hip and stuff.
What I would love to see is her be able to maintain her sort of joyous spirit and not have it so negatively impacted by CMT.
When you see Reagan in isolation, you don't notice necessarily how difficult or delayed she is until you see her kind of running with her peers. That's the hardest for me. I mean, if you see her go to the park, I start crying. It's not fair. I think the worst part of CMT is the pain that they experience that you can't do anything about, and the fact that it invades every part of your life.
It's kind of hard for me because sometimes I wake up in the mornings and my hip starts to hurt a little bit. My legs are sometimes really stiff and so are my hands.
There's nothing easy about CMT, but being able for her to talk about it and express what she's feeling, I think has really made a difference and is really important for her.
My dad taught me like a few tips and tricks. He taught me not to cry over it. But he told me, use CMT as an advantage. That made me a lot happier that I was able to like use that tiny part of whom I am to form me.
I would say that 70% of my day is actually focused in one way or another on dealing with CMT and its repercussions.
I also can't do a lot of my own things like cook for myself or like take a shower by myself.
You know, I'm taking care of both of them, both from a grooming standpoint, but also getting them to where they need to go.
I do physical therapy, but I try to make it as fun as I can because working is very important for me, so I get stronger.
Typically she goes for an hour and a half a day. And it's real physical therapy. I mean, it's squats and wall sits, and most people call it CrossFit. She's tired. Her day starts at 8:15 and ends at 6 every day and nonstop, and that's a long day for her.
I work in a very competitive field, and if you have CMT, you have to work that much harder. And so I have a regimen in the morning that can take 2 to 3 hours, and what I've decided to do is to just be determined about doing that every day and not letting it stop me.
And he would spend over an hour bracing his foot.
I sort of create a mini medical supply store. Bandages in and of themselves are hard because I don't have the finger dexterity to open Band-Aids. You're talking about 3.5 hours to get up before you go to the office. The thing about CMT that differentiates it from many other disabilities is that it's hereditary. And you know, I gave it to my daughter. There's nothing that I can do to take that away. I don't care what happened to me. It's about my daughter and her having to face this possibly with her daughter. The importance of raising awareness that the Hereditary Neuropathy Foundation is taking as a main goal is so critical in not just driving, you know, treatment and medical development. It's helping people now with how they feel about themselves and getting people to talk about this in a way that they weren't comfortable before.
This is a degenerative disease, and we're a young family. So when Phil was hospitalized last year for respiratory failure, I feel like that was a huge wake-up call for our family, is to like, we don't know what is around the corner.
I'm certainly optimistic about treatment. Even if not for me, for my daughter, I think that could well be a reality.
It's imperative on us to raise awareness and to find a cure for this, because if we can help 1 in 2,500 people live their lives pain-free without the deformities and the surgeries and the medical costs and the insurance and the social impact and the depression and the anxiety and it's just imperative that we find a solution now.
We are the voices of CMT. Thank you so much. So the film was well received as it resulted in the desired outcome of the FDA and stakeholders truly understanding how devastating it is to live with CMT, the unmet medical need, and the urgency for treatments. Our number one priority is to push for fast track of 2 pipeline late-stage drugs to treat certain types of CMT, which, if approved, will be the first ever drug treatments for our condition. And now the hard work starts, the voice of the patient report and benefit risk analysis. We need to reduce this voice of the patient report, and we have a lot of work ahead of us to get that done. So what is the takeaway from both of our talks today? The takeaway is your voice matters. And we're here if anybody has any questions. We're going to start off with Joy is going to ask a couple questions of the two of us, and we offer anybody who has questions for us to please fire away.
I think I want to just start by thanking you both for telling us more about your strategy for approaching the FDA for an externally led patient-focused drug development meeting. So I was wondering if you both might comment on what kind of information does the FDA want to receive? What is the most impactful and beneficial?
So I think that they're interested in hearing the impact of the disease on the lives of patients and what they would consider to be impactful for them. And so one of the things that our patients wanted to tell them, the FDA, was that incremental change was important to our patient population. In the intermediate form of SMA, the children can sit but never walk. And one of the messages that they said long and clear, including adults with the intermediate form of SMA, was that their expectation from a drug was not to walk again. Of course, that would be wonderful, but small changes that affect independence and lead to activities of daily living were exceptionally meaningful to them. And we had an adult with SMA tell a really compelling story about how she, just being able to push the joystick on her motorized wheelchair or use a computer mouse and not losing that ability, just having stability across the disease, not slow functional change, is really important to her. So 10 years from now, she would still have the independence of being able to do those things. And I think the FDA wants to hear that. They want to hear that, these small things are important to you. They also want to hear what risks you're willing to trade off for that. That's how they decide whether they're going to approve drugs. And so they want to hear those things directly from the patients.
I think the most important thing for us is CMT has been known to be a disease that's not fatal. And through our patient registry and a lot of the pre-polling we did leading up to the event, we realized that 34% of patients have respiratory dysfunction. So now we all need to breathe. Now we know that this disease does affect lifespan. So we really needed to get that across to the FDA. Just like SMA, we have symptoms that vary widely, even within the same families. So we had a very good representation of the mutations that were very severe, and of course, then the ones that were more mild and moderate. So I think they got it. They really, really got that there's urgency for us. So I thought that was really important. I think knowing what your community really needs and finding the right people to represent what those symptoms are and how it's impacting their life and the caregivers. We didn't really talk about that. That's also really, really important. And also the economics behind the medical cost and lost jobs and the future for children and getting married, especially when you're dealing with a genetic disease. So I think we have a few more questions, but because of the time, I think it's best that we open it up to the group here. If anybody has any questions for us, that would be ideal.
Thank you very much for this presentation. I'm Siri Vaith. I'm with Cystic Fibrosis Research Incorporated, and we are thrilled that on October 29th, we are having an externally led patient-focused drug development meeting, and Rosangel was extremely helpful, and we did follow a lot of the model, and we have James Valentine and all those things. But I'm wondering, you mentioned, and actually both of you mentioned the benefit risk framework, and you're wishing that you had pulled out more about the risk. So I want to front load now to think, because yes, the benefits are easier. Are you thinking this is something you wish you had had your panelists touch more upon specifically in advance, or with the polling questions specifically, like the great polling questions you had about what people would be willing, what would keep them from a clinical trial? So what would you have done differently that I could maybe now do?
So I think I would, yes, I would have panelists speak to that, and I would also design some polling questions around that. I mean, I think, when you do what we did after the fact, which is a benefit risk survey, certainly you can do that, and we did that following what the Myotonic Dystrophy Foundation did. But that is a survey which is complicated, and it's kind of a burdensome survey for your community to fill out, just because of the way the statistics of it work. They have to answer a lot of questions, and so we heard from our community that that survey was actually quite challenging for them. So I would really recommend that you do try to bring it out during the meeting, and I think you could devise polling questions to try to do that. We did not have polling questions around risk, and I think that is something that I would change if I were to do it again.
So for us, because we had the help of SMA and some of the other groups, we knew how important it was. And honestly, Joy and I, 2 days before, we were scrambling for 3 last polling questions, and really they seemed to be the most impactful. So we were grateful to Jill and Rosangel for that. But I'd also like to say, and I know CF is a pretty well-defined, because I've followed it for a long time, seen the films through the years and so forth. But I think in some cases, you almost need to have the meeting so you can identify the questions. As advocates and running these organizations, we think we know almost everything because we're so close to it. But often there's people out there you don't really know. And we've identified things over the years that were almost shocking to us, and especially industry. And I'm just going to mention one in particular because I think it's important. Our industry sponsors were not putting outcome measures in for pain. And through a PRO study, patient-reported outcome study we did with one of our industry partners, initially that question wasn't even in there, and we insisted it. And the first word that came to mind when they thought of CMT was pain. So, oh my God, I mean, pain, more so than drop foot, more so than even breathing complications. So I think that this meeting did help us find even more things that now we have to address. So I think it's a combination of both.
Just to touch on that, I mean, we had a similar experience where patients told us through this process and some of the pre-planning stages that fatigue was incredibly important to them, and that it's not just what motor functions they're capable of doing, but are they capable of doing them at 5 p.m. or 8 p.m.? When they're tired, can they do those things? And so that's, I think, become a big rallying point in SMA right now about how you can have therapies that impact fatigue. But one thing that Allison said is that it's important to do pre-work, like you talked about how you had looked through your registry data, things like that. And we had done a lot of focus groups and collection of stories too. So, there is homework you have to do, I would say, in an ideal world, several years in advance, so you know how to direct the content of your PFDD meeting.
I'll also mention, by doing the focus groups, and we primarily did the focus groups with children, we identified stellar kids. As you can see, this was one of them, Reagan, in this movie who also did a testimony. She's only 9 years old. I mean, she was unbelievable. And just going through that focus group, which we actually did not do in person, we did in a go-to meeting, we grabbed her. We said, oh my God, would you be willing to do this? And then we thought, well, we knew the family. We asked them about the film. So I think doing a lot of this homework helps you to develop the agenda of the meeting and find the right people to get the message across. And we knew we had one shot at this. We had to make it really, really count. So.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
I had a question about how did you navigate in the meeting current treatments or maybe treatments in development? So I'm not sure what treatments are out for those, but we have an FDA-approved treatment and a couple in trials, and so I'm just wondering how we would navigate people talking about, well, my disease on this treatment versus the natural. Did you try to focus on the natural history outside of treatment, or how did you handle that?
So I think for SMA, we were in a really unique situation because when we filed our letter of intent and requested the meeting, we had no approved drug for SMA. And the PDUFA date for that was in the spring, April of 2017. And we were expecting that we would be talking a lot about why we felt this drug had clinically meaningful impact at our PFDD meeting, but it got approved in December of 2016. So we actually spent a lot of time talking about unmet medical need. I think we had people who had been in the clinical trials, because there wasn't much commercial experience with the drug yet, talk about how impactful it was to their daily lives, but that they still wish that other things were addressed. And so we tried to balance those two things, talk about the incredible hope and optimism the drug approval gave us, but things we saw on the horizon that we were going to have to address in the future in terms of unmet medical need. But I think that is a balancing act that you have to think about.
And I can briefly answer that. So we had two experts, one that gave a very layman term overview of CMT. Then we had a leading geneticist who was able to really talk about emerging gene therapy technology and how it may have an impact for the various forms of CMT and neuropathies. And then we had a clinical expert who did an overview of the pipeline, both preclinical and clinical. So we did have call-outs of some of these testimonies saying, my father's on this drug, or I really hope this drug that's in the pipeline will be approved. And I think also, like what you brought up, Jill, I think just showing the unmet medical need and the impairment of the disability. The FDA knows the drugs that are in clinical trials. They know the inclusion criteria. They know the primary endpoints. They know the secondary endpoints. So I think that they gather enough information to help them understand the disease enough that when the pharmaceutical company presents the data, they'll be able to make a really smart assessment if they should approve the drug, if the endpoints show a positive. So there's several ways to do it. So I just have to say, from the standpoint of HNF, and we already know SMA, Cure SMA has been unbelievable with all the meetings that have come after them. If anybody wants help from us, we're happy to share all our information with anybody in the room and do whatever we can, because it's really an amazing, amazing meeting that will accelerate therapies for any of the rare diseases that are here today.
We want to give a big thank you to Joy, Allison, and Jill for sharing your experience and your findings with us. So this concludes the first day of breakout sessions. Make sure that as you walk out the door, you take a second to jump on your mobile app and do a survey to provide feedback for this session. And also invite you back to the main ballroom to learn more about the Thrive Collaborative Initiative with our closing presentation, Lives Changed, Stories with Impact. Following that will be our night net reception sponsored by Rare. Thanks again for everybody for joining us, and have a good night.